Hello, and welcome to Female Forces, a podcast dedicated to highlighting influential women throughout literature. Kicking off this podcast is a series focusing on female writers and early American literature. During a time when women held fewer rights, these authors were inserting themselves in the narrative and navigating their positions within the world. Many of them found clever ways to talk about problematic issues regarding colonization, race, gender, religion, you name it. Women were writing during this time period. And although many of these female authors are less well known, trust me, they are worth knowing. So, thank you for listening and joining me for this episode of Female Forces. Without further ado, let's travel back in time to colonial New England, where we'll meet our first author, Anne Bradstreet. Here is a short biography about her. Thank you to Poets.org, the University of Victoria, and Dr. Bryce Peterson for providing me with a lot of this background information. Anne Bradstreet was born Anne Dudley outside of London in 1612. She married her husband, Simon Bradstreet, at the age of 16. Pause. Fun fact, or rather not so fun fact, getting married at the age of 16 was not normal for the time. The average age for women getting married was actually 23, so Anne Bradstreet was married at an extremely young age. With her husband, Bradstreet immigrated to the American colonies with John Winthrop's Puritan group. She herself belonged to the Puritan faith. She was the mother of 8 children, and on top of all that, Anne Bradstreet was the first published American poet. How cool is that? Anne Bradstreet was not simply the first American female poet to have their work published, but the first American poet, period, to have their work published. Now, here's the not-so-cool part. Her brother-in-law took her poems across the great big ocean without Anne Bradstreet's knowledge. So, although we must celebrate the fact that Anne Bradstreet was writing at the time and that she was the first published American author, her poems were published without her consent, which touches on some of the issues that women faced at the time and continue facing today. Now that we've focused on Bradstreet's life, let's dive into her poetry. Bradstreet addresses many different themes and issues throughout her work. As a religious woman, she often wrote in a genre called devotional poetry, which talks about God and nature and the act of contemplation. She also reflected on the state of New England's relationship with Great Britain. She makes very subtle commentaries on gender and being a female poet. She writes letters about life and loss. There's seriously so much to talk about within her work. But for these podcast episodes, what I'll be doing is choosing one specific work to focus on. This is an extremely difficult task, but usually I'll choose something that feels relevant to my life and my experience as a woman, or I'll select something that relates to the bigger picture of feminism or another lens as a whole. Today I'll be focusing on one of her lesser-known works that holds a special place in my heart, a short poem titled In Memory of My Dear Grandchild Anne Bradstreet, who deceased June 20th, 1669, being 3 years and 7 months old. This poem marks another type of poetry frequently written by Bradstreet called memorial poetry. These works typically remember and honor a loved one or person of importance who passed away. For Bradstreet, she, like many mothers and women, was well acquainted with death. Throughout her work, she mentions the death of at least 3 grandchildren and 1 daughter-in-law. Her memorial poetry often wrestles with their passings, her personal religious beliefs, and the tension between them. Before digging deeper into the poem and Bradstreet's style of writing, I'd like to read her poem aloud. Here's In Memory of My Dear Grandchild, Anne Bradstreet. With troubled heart and trembling hand I write, the heavens have changed to sorrow my delight. How oft with disappointment have I met, when I on fading things my hopes have set. Experience might for this have made me wise, to value things according to their price. Was ever stable joy yet found below, or perfect bliss without mixture of woe? I knew she was but as a withering flower, that's here today, perhaps gone in an hour, like as a bubble or the brittle glass, or like a shadow turning as it was. More fool, then, I to look on that was lent, as if mine own, when thus impermanent. Farewell, dear child, thou ne'er shalt come to me, but yet a while, and I shall go to thee. Meantime my throbbing heart's cheered up with this, thou with thy Saviour art in endless bliss. Beautiful. Now, on the surface, Bradstreet's poem may seem like a pretty basic poem from that time period. After all, she writes in heroic couplets that reflect an AABB rhyme pattern. She also writes in iambic pentameter with a pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables. These provide the poem with a sing-song sound reminiscent of Shakespeare's sonnets. So, although it might sound flowery, old-timey, and cliché to our modern ears, what Bradstreet is doing with rhyme and rhythm in this poem is phenomenal. She is inserting herself into a long line of poetry and tradition by mimicking previous writers. Even within that pre-existing framework and genre of memorial poetry, the content of her poem, the word choice and comparisons, reflect true and honest emotions of grief and pain. She especially captures the feeling of losing someone too soon by comparing it to fading elements of nature, like bursting bubbles, brittle glass, fading shadows, and withering flowers. Bradstreet often uses nature in her similes, metaphors, and comparisons because it's something that people are familiar with. But what strikes me most about this poem is just the grappling that takes place between her grief and her religious beliefs. Although Bradstreet was a very pious and faithful woman, she blames the heaven for changing her delight into sorrow. She also asks, "How oft with disappointment have I met? And was ever stable joy yet found below, or perfect bliss without mixture of woe?" These questions and comments seem like rhetorical internal question, but they could also be existential, almost as if they are being directed towards God. Like, why me, and why is this so hard? Despite being a woman of faith and dealing with previously painful experiences, she was still grieving. By the end of the poem, she affirms that she will see her grandchild again. But the rest of the poem still shifts back and forth between belief and supposed weakness. By writing this poem and admitting these honest feelings, Bradstreet acknowledges this tension, and in a way, acknowledging the existence of that tension makes it valid and okay to experience. Some women undergo such emotional labor where they feel like they need to manage their feelings or personal emotions to help regulate another person's emotions or fit within some societal standard. For Bradstreet, she may have felt a need to maintain her religious appearance. After all, in the poem, she calls herself a fool for forgetting her granddaughter's life was temporary and practically forgetting God in the equation. However, with this poem, she lets her guard down a little bit and admits that grief is hard. In the end, she still has a positive outlook, but that honesty and vulnerability shows that faith and grief can coexist. It's okay to sit in that tension. I read this poem earlier this year at a time in my life where I lost my uncle, grandpa, and great-uncle all within a 1 to 2 month span. I'd never experienced death so close to me, and with all my schoolwork and life obligations, it seemed like I had to keep moving forward, like I couldn't fall behind in my classes and I couldn't be too sad. Yet for a while, life was really fuzzy and dull. I was carrying some of that emotional labor. Reading Anne Bradstreet's poem showed me that I could be honest about what I was feeling. She also showed that tensions between grief and religion are okay to feel and experience. It's okay to feel sad and cry when your grandpa dies because you cared about him and loved him so much. It's okay to wonder why so many people are leaving. But it's also okay to feel hope in the end. Her memorial poetry arrived at the perfect time in my life. It helped me contemplate a lot of things. In closing, Anne Bradstreet herself felt a lot of things, and she was a lot of things. There is a great article about Anne Bradstreet by Laura Major called Anne Bradstreet, the Religious Poet and Mother. And in that article, Major talks about how many readers and scholars often read Bradstreet's writing through one particular lens. However, this disregards all the different roles and identities she carried. Major writes that Bradstreet's poem reveal her love, her sacrificial devotion, and her heartfelt concern for the physical and spiritual welfare of her children. Yet her faith and her piety remain, even in these personal domestic poems, a central axis in her life. Another axis was her poetry. In fact, she viewed her poems also as kinds of children, offspring that she cared for, and that would provide her with the immortality that she sought. Thus, I conclude by avoiding a reduction of Bradstreet to pious Puritan or rebellious woman. Her poetry exposes both piety and quiet rebellion." End quote. Major and Bradstreet's writing prove that women can be many things simultaneously. I love that Bradstreet reflects and reveres that tension in her work. She doesn't shy away from the fact that her love or her family occasionally supersedes her love for God. She is a poet. She is a mother. She is a woman. She is a Puritan. And she is honest. Moving forward, I hope to embrace each part of my identity and allow them to coexist. I also hope to be vulnerable and honest when experiencing grief and other strong emotions. You can too if you'd like. Thank you for joining this first episode of Female Forces and learning about the first published American poet.